One of the biggest challenges I would say in manufacturing things or in designing physical products is to keep the design intent throughout the process.
Welcome to the Industry of UX, a podcast crafted to review, share, and discuss the ins and outs of the user experience industry. Let's dive into the episode. Hello again, you wonderful UXers. Welcome back to another episode of the Industry of UX. I'm your host, Filippo Levotti. I'm glad to be here with you today. If, like me, you're passionate about good design and you have an interest in physical products, well, today is your lucky day, my friend, because we talk about industrial design with Lucas Couto, Senior Industrial Designer at X Designs. Let me give you an idea of what Lucas actually does. This is a 2019 clip where he's presenting his work for a health innovation product that measures the brain activity in newborn babies.
I'm here today to share a bit of my experience designing medical devices. My latest big medtech project, the Stratus EG system. And in this project, I was the project manager behind the design and engineering teams and also acted as the lead designer and assisting mechanical engineer. In only 15 months, we managed to design 4 new products, including the 8 PCBs. PCB is basically the electronic boards that goes inside the product. From user insight to production models to a company that had never worked with medical devices before.
Following the process along from user insight all the way to manufacturing, it's super interesting. And there is so much that goes into it. Today, Lucas and I talk about the world of physical products and industrial design, how the process works, the overlap with digital design, Lucas' missed opportunity to have custom-made toys when he was a kid, and how plastic may be indeed a necessary evil, at least for some industries. Let me know what you think about the episode by tweeting at IndustryUX or leaving a comment on our subreddit at IndustryUX. No offense to Android users, but if you like the episode, head over to Apple Podcast and leave a 5-star rating and a review. It helps us climb the charts, bring the podcast to a wider audience, and ultimately produce a better show. Now, on to the conversation with Lucas.
It was not something that parked or something that started at some point because, of course, I grew up like most designers playing with things and creating things and maybe playing with Legos and making my own toys. But I don't know, I think the realization that I wanted to work with something creative or something that profession where I could make things came only in high school. And of course, I didn't know anything about design. Coming from Brazil, I think you're very privileged to learn about design before university or something. So I first thought that I would do engineering because it's what I thought it was a profession that engineers are the ones creating things. But then I figured out that architecture was the thing. Architecture was the profession where people make things and things out there made by architects. So I decided to do that. So in Brazil, you apply for university, right? So I applied to a bunch of courses so I could guarantee that I would get into some university. I didn't get into the university that I wanted for architecture. I got in another one, but at the same time, I got into this industrial design course in a very prestigious, in a very prestigious university in my state, which is the State University. So I decided to just go and see what was this thing. And I was just, to be honest, freaking lucky because it was exactly what I wanted from architecture. When I got there, I think first month, I realized that was it. And I wouldn't go for architecture anymore. And everything I wanted was there. Of course, in 1 month, you still don't know what's designed. Not knowing what was designed before, I still didn't know, but you realize that at least what you feel that is what you want to do, or at least what I wanted to do was there. So that was my trajectory to get into university. And then I also saw that a lot of what I've learned, because my dad worked with injection molding his whole life. And injection molding is just the process of molding plastic into shape to make products. Plastic products, usually you're going to form them somehow. And injection molding is one of the most popular processes. So he worked with that for a long time, not designing products, but he was a industrial manager. So I grew up going to the factories. Like every other weekend, I would follow my dad, and he had to do something in the factory. So I would run around with my kick scooter between the machines and smell that smell of melted plastic, of melted polypropylene or polyethylene. And that's the smell that to this day, when I go to factories, I feel like going back to childhood. So that was something that I lived with. So I knew about plastics more in high school than I knew about basic chemistry. So when I got into school and I learned about process and manufacturing for in a design sense, that was such a big connection, and it was so natural to me that it was also something that made me realize that's what I'm going to do. It's related to what my dad did, but in the other side, he was manufacturing, and now I'm going to design those things. So I think that was a pretty good realization of making something that it was natural to me to do since I was a kid.
Okay, there are two things I find extremely interesting. First off, you were exposed to design at such a young age, which is an amazing experience to have. And two, your dad worked with plastic materials. When I was a kid, if my dad had a job like that, I would have constantly pestered him and asked him to make me toys and all kinds of gadgets. Did you do that?
No, not really. That's an interesting because now that you're saying, I should have said that. And that's pretty interesting because I think maybe because my dad was not working with very sexy things, maybe because I think for a big period my dad was working with auto parts, so he was making the panel of the car or all the plastic parts in the doors of a car. So that was not, it was just a bunch of plastic things. But then he worked at some, like, several periods of his life he worked with consumer goods. When I was born, he was working at Gillette for a long time. So I think to this date, he has like boxes and boxes of razors of 1991, 1990 at his place because I think he has a big collection of everything he ever produced. So for me, I think it was plastic or injection molding was related to those things. If he had worked with toys, definitely I would ask for toys. But I think I never realized that my dad could make Legos. But I think I knew from the beginning that this process is freaking expensive. The machines are huge. If I ask my dad, hey, dad, can you make this for me? I know that it's not going to happen. I think this was something from the beginning I knew, like, my dad was always very clear. He was not teaching me this. Like, I was following the conversations and he was always talking about plastics. And we would go to the stores and my dad would always look at the bottom of plastic parts and package to see what materials were there. And it's funny because today I do the same. That's, I think, is like a circle of life kind of thing. But I think I realized from very early on that the process of making something or at least manufacturing plastics, it's really complex. It's really expensive. Seeing the machines close, all those hoses and the noise and the heat and the water. My dad doesn't have a thumb. He lost a thumb in an accident in the mid 80s or something in injection molding. He was manufacturing at the time glass frames. I think that was pretty clear to me that this process is not for kids. So I don't know. Maybe that was the disconnection between toys and plastics. Maybe.
I still think your dad's job was very cool, but let's talk about your current job. You went from your country of origin, Brazil, where you were working as an industrial designer, to moving all the way to Trondheim in Norway and work for X Design. How did that happen?
Well, yeah. So 3 years ago or so, I was back in Brazil. I was working for a while already in industrial design, and I was the lead industrial designer of a small studio. But I was tired, needed to move, both because the job was not great anymore, it was not fulfilling, and because Brazil is not, it's a great place to start, but it's not a place you're gonna make a career, at least not industrial design. And I mean, I'm generalizing here, of course, but it was my case in the time. So I was looking for jobs abroad, but I was looking mainly for in-house work. I was a bit tired of consultancy, but that was not why I got here, because during that process, I was on Instagram sharing more and more of my work. We just to, of course, get to know people around the world and also to see what people were making and so on. And then I created this page, Weekly Design Challenge, with a friend of mine, where we're just asking people to share stuff. So through that, I get to know this guy. I met this guy from Norway called Carl. He's one of the founders of Eggs. And we just became Instagram friends. We're just talking about design and stuff. And they had a studio in Brazil back then. And we were talking about the situation in Brazil, the design industry in Brazil, and so on. And then I mentioned that I was looking for jobs abroad. And then he said, "Oh, we have an opening here." And then we just started talking, and like maybe 3 months after I moved here. So they flew me in for an interview, and sure, I liked the place. It looked great. Eggs is a great place. I saw it back then, and it still holds that. And yeah, that was an interesting Instagram. What's the name? It's recruiting, like passive recruiting almost.
Sounds like an Instagram generated job. Okay, let's talk industrial design. Many, if not most of us out there, are digital designers, be it UI, UX, interaction, and so on. For the most part, everything we make is done in pixels. How does the process of physical design work? How is it different from digital design, and how similar is it?
Yeah, I think exactly as you said, it's in a way it's pretty similar, because if you go back 100 years to Bauhaus, or 60 plus years to the whole Germany scenario at the time, and then you go to Italy in the 70s, 80s, and so on, all that foundation of what is design today and what was the split between architecture and industrial design back then, I think that foundation still stands very strong, So I think even though, of course, technology came and things changed a lot, methodologies improved, and there's a lot of new methods and tools, still the foundation is there. So I would say that in any design discipline, if you're approaching the same Bauhausian way of approaching design, I think you're starting a good way already. I think if you look back to this, the Bauhaus, the Ulm situation, you're still going to find more or less the process of industrial design. So we start by, understanding a problem. Usually there's a problem, or there's a brief, or there's a hunch, and you try to align that to expectations and goals with the client, if you have a client, or with your team in-house, or something like that. And you try to align that with a bigger strategy. Still, design needs to make sense for business. So there's an underlying strategy behind everything, with the brand values and with the marketing strategy and so on and so forth. Starting from there, from this problem, from this collection of strategy with the brief and so on, you ideally start, as you said, with user insight. You go there, you try to test your assumptions, you try to check your biases, you try to learn from the users, you do observation, you do interviews and so on. And then you gather that and you try to make sense of information. And I think that's one of the most powerful things of designers, which is the ability of making sense out of things and connecting things. So hopefully if you collect that information, then you can move on to ideation. Then you have a lot of sketches, a lot of mock-ups happening. Ideally, I would say that a good process, you're iterating all the time. So you're trying to prototype as much as possible. If I look back 6 years, 7 years ago when I was starting, I would have very defined parts of the process or steps. So I would sketch, then I would stop, then I would prototype. And today I feel that it's much more natural. Things happen in a much more iterative way. And that's definitely helpful to the process.
Pause for a second. When you say prototype, what do you mean exactly?
And that's an interesting question, because there is a language thing here too. Because if I say that in Portuguese, I think prototype is much more focused on the final stages of prototyping and testing something in Portuguese. But in English, we use prototype for everything, right? Like for most, at least in industrial design, we use for most parts of the process, even when you're just mock-upping or just model making. So we don't often use those words. But yeah, usually early on, when you're still ideating, I'm talking about making mock-ups by using paper, foam, clay, whatever you have at your reach, that is cheap, that is fast, and you can quickly generate something. So I think that's the most crucial part. And the same goes for sketching. The value here is in visualizing, communicating. It's not about detailing things from the beginning, right? Like we have to present ideas. We have to try to approach this problem in different ways. And if you try to finalize things through all your directions, you're going to spend an infinite amount of time and resources. So in the beginning, it's always about quantity and efficiency and efficacy and all those nice words that make a lot of sense in business. They make a lot of sense here too, because you need to be fast and you need to quickly visualize things. And of course, you're going to do this and you're going to be able to make decisions because you have a certain quantity. You've been through that. You explore things. Ideally, you're also testing those things with customers, maybe with users or any stakeholder in the process that you can use to test. So you'll probably move on after ideating, having concepts, conceptualizing something. You'd move on to then a CAD software, some 3D modeling software or something like that. So you can start realizing that in a different way and maybe start detailing that and then prototype in a more complex and time consuming, let's say, or let's say just a complex way, more complex prototypes, also testing that. I think, again, it's all about iterating. So in every step of the process, there is a lot of testing, communicating, and so on and so forth. So then you detail things. You're probably going to collaborate with engineers. A lot of industrial designers have experience in design for manufacturing. I can definitely myself design certain plastics for manufacturing, like detail things up until they're in the hands of a mold maker. But ideally, it's not what we do. I think we should have the time to design, and I'm sure that any good mechanical engineer can do the job I do much faster and much better. We try to split a bit there, but the role of the industrial designer is still very important, even if you hand out something, because you still need to keep the design intent. So one of the biggest challenges I would say in manufacturing things or in designing physical products is to keep the design intent throughout the process. Because when you hand out that to an engineer, and then the engineer will hand out to a mold maker, and then the mold maker will manufacture that. So there's a lot of steps there. There are many bridges there that you have to cross, and many chances of losing the track of the product and so on.
It sounds like the industrial design process, including prototyping, is somewhat very similar up until you actually have to deal with the manufacturing of the physical product.
If I can try to trace, the similarities and the differences here is that I think we prototype in a very similar way. Like the goals are very similar, and I think the ways we prototype, even though the materials are different, I think the approach is very similar too. Because sometimes you may have a prototype that is just a wireframe. It's just for the sake of understanding the flow. It's not for the aesthetics. As and it's the same when we, for example, just make something in clay that doesn't look great, but you're gonna feel. For example, you're gonna touch it and you're gonna feel how you grab it, how you take it, how it feels in your hands or whatever. So that's one purpose. Another purpose could be just a concept that you're trying to probe with users. It's also a prototype, but that one is just aesthetics, for example. So we could have a product that is just a prototype that is very nice looking, but it doesn't work at all. So all those things that are very similar. But I think then when we split here is that you have to consider too when you're designing that someone is going to code that thing has to live in a hardware still. It has to live in a hardware and a software that work. And I think in industrial design, you still have to think that this has to work. You have to think about feasibility all the time. I think one of the complex parts of industrial design is that you have so many different processes that a wooden product and a plastic product have completely different processes. A metal product is completely different. A lot of people think about industrial design and they think about Apple products, and the way Apple manufactures metal and glass is completely different than some manufacturers metal and glass. So you not only have the different materials, but you also have the different process from different industries. So I think that's the part that gets a bit more complex, and for sure, no designer knows all those aspects. Usually, you have a bit more about plastics or know a bit more about metal, but you have to know more or less what's going on out there. You have to know that you cannot make an injection molded table with a 6 millimeter, 8 millimeter, 10 millimeter thickness because it's not going to work. But you don't have to detail that for manufacturing yourself. So it's the same as a digital designer doesn't have to code everything they make.
Okay, one thing that I love about digital design is how quickly and relatively cheaply we can iterate. Let's say you're working on a website. You go through the entire design thinking process, and because of circumstances, you take a couple of informed assumptions and you launch it. Fast forward 3 months, and it turns out that the checkout process needs some improvement. You do the research, the design, and you iterate and launch it. And in a few days to a few weeks, maybe months, depending on the size of the project and the improvements, and you're done. Now, let's talk physical products. I have a hunch that this quick process is not really going to work the same way. How do you handle iterations in industrial design?
That's a great point because that's definitely, if we want to talk about the differences, that's probably one of the biggest differences. That, especially if you think about, again, going back to the plastic part. I know that today plastic is something very evil and people are talking about plastic, and I'm all for that because if you have one-use plastic like packaging, that's stupid. That shouldn't exist. But still, plastic is probably one of the most important materials you have out there. Our lives wouldn't be the same without plastic. But anyways, going to a plastic part. After you make a mold, after you tool, you machine the metal there that costs thousands and thousands of dollars to make. You're set. You're done. So that's the challenge here. If you manufacture something and you realize later that something didn't work, as you said, in one way you can be very forgiven, but that's not going to pay off in the end if you're making something physical. Because if it doesn't work, then we're talking about maybe millions of investment down the drain. So that's absolutely true. But of course, there are some processes that can adapt to that or are suited to these types of mistakes or I'm not going to call a mistake, but this type of process where you want to learn from the product and you're going to iterate again. Machine things, for example, are okay. Like making furniture is something that, of course, after if you release a batch, you're screwed. But if you make one at a time, you can learn, you can modify. But anything that you need a tool to make, it's a completely different beast. Because we're talking about time because you have the lead time to make a tool. So, for example, if we want to launch now a product for Christmas 2021, we have to consider, of course, the design of this. It's going to take X months, but you have to consider that to make the tool, you need at least 2 3 months. And if we have several tools, probably going to add on that. Then you need to verify all those parts, and you can add 1 2 months just for that. You need probably the prototypes before going to tooling that take time too. If you're going to prototype something, it's going to take weeks, maybe a month or so. So when you trickle down this thing, suddenly you're late already. So those things are, I think, is a very good point because you have to check, you have to prototype over and over to make sure that you're not wasting money.
You just mentioned plastic being evil, and let's just briefly touch on that, shall we? With your knowledge of plastic, do you think it's a necessary evil, or are there any valid alternatives we can use, especially when it comes to industrial design?
And I think this is a very complex discussion, especially because it's so popular now. And again, one-use plastic, it's evil, in my opinion. Most of it, of course, there are some cases, like for example, for medical purpose, for surgeries and so on. There's a lot of one-use plastic that is life-saving and it's necessary. But of course, that's not tons and tons of plastic. Bottle of, soda, whatever, or a straw. I think those things they shouldn't exist. And now, talking about fast moving consumer goods, which is any bottle of any detergent or soda or whatever plastic you have, the supermarket is fast moving consumer goods, right? That's a very difficult challenge. To be honest, in the scale we have of production today in the world, I don't know. I don't know if there's a solution how we solve that in a big scale. I think we have to start somewhere, and I think some companies are doing some things. I think it's all very small, all very shy, and I think the consumers have a big role here in pushing and pressuring companies. I think that's the only way we're gonna see some change for sure. But even thinking, even if companies are willing to make the change, I still feel that it's gonna be a very big challenge to just to replace completely plastic for consumer goods like this. But plastic in general, I think that that's the line we have to draw here. Is that one thing is a plastic that you're gonna touch as a consumer. Talking about the user experience here, you open a device or something, you have a plastic part, you have a plastic film or something. You're gonna touch it once, you're gonna throw it away. That plastic is not gonna disappear in 1,000, 2,000 years. That's stupid. That shouldn't exist. That doesn't make sense. But a plastic that lasts, I'm looking at my computer mouse here all the time. If this product is well made and it lasts 5, 10 years, it's paying off a lot. So if you design plastic to last, there's no material like plastic. There's nothing on earth that can replace plastic for the purpose or for the use we give it to. So you cannot replace the plastic in a. I'm looking at the computer mouse, or I can look at anything like any consumer electronics. You're not going to be able to replace it. At least not now. I don't know. Maybe one day. Maybe if we have the same conversation in 60 years, we're going to talk about a new material. But I think that's the line we have to trace here. That one thing is the plastic that is used for a couple seconds and doesn't have a reason. There's no structural reason for being or anything. It's just to protect paper from scratches, like a film around a consumer electronic box. That plastic shouldn't exist. There's definitely a solution for that. But it's very easy and comfortable today to just put that film there or to put that straw on the juice box. But we should do better. We should design better.
Okay, we're getting to the end of the episode. Lucas, thank you so much for coming on the show. I'd love to have you back in the future. Maybe we can do a Q&A from our Reddit community. Okay, we talked about digital design and the overlap and differences with industrial design. Let me throw in a new scenario. What would you tell a kid that is interested in both types of design and is asking advice on which one to make a career out of?
What I'll tell them is that if they are interested in design, I mean, if they have basic knowledge of design, it's already an easy conversation. But I'll definitely approach this in a way that letting them know that design, I would say that design is something before than digital design, before than industrial design or service design, there is design as a whole. Like we talked about the similarities between the disciplines and so on. And I think that's the most important part of it. Is to understand that there is a methodology, that we have this human-centered approach. We have to think about the user. We have to think about the stakeholders. That's very important. And I don't know at what point you can choose or how you choose it, but I think what I would say to a kid that is very interested in design is that, first of all, you have to go beyond the names, as I said, industrial design or UX or UI, because even in UX, right, like user experience these days is the name we give to a specific part of the digital design process. And it became a name for a discipline in a way, but something that I heard many times and I like to repeat a lot, especially to students, is that a good user experience is an outcome of good design. Doesn't matter what type of design, right? So, be aware of the names. Names change. Names are different in different places. So don't worry that much don't worry so much about putting yourself in the product design box. Even because product design is also a name that changed. We used to be called product designers, not anymore. Or I mean, some companies still call industrial designers product designers. So it's a bit messy, that part. So I'll just tell kids to approach design in a more not a general sense, but approach the foundation of design with an open heart and an open mind. And I think it's gonna be all about what touches you the most. I don't think if I go back now as a teenager, I don't know if I would be able to choose that well. I think it's natural to go to digital because it's such an invasive and important thing of our lives, and we probably don't understand that much how industrial design affects our lives, even though we're surrounded by products all the time. But I don't know. I think again, telling them to approach design in a very open way, and industrial design is super cool. It's super intense. It's gratifying, but digital design can also be. And I can also tell them that if one day everything breaks, if we don't have internet and electricity anymore, industrial designers can still make some furniture out of some tree branches or something. I don't know what digital designers will do if everything shuts down at some point.
Let me ask you, where can people find you online?
Yes, I think the best place is still Instagram. Lucas Couto 27. Couto, it's probably written in here in the name of the episode. And on LinkedIn, I've been posting more and more on LinkedIn. I think it's, to be honest, it's probably a better platform than Instagram these days for sharing work, design work. That's another place. And I've been mentoring a few students here and there, some students in the US especially. And of course, if there is something, if people want to reach out and they're doing a project and they want to just test or just present, or I'm always available to do stuff. And especially these days, I've been volunteering a lot for social impact projects. I think that's something very fulfilling and, in a way, like giving back to the community or to society, like what I learned throughout these years. It's a really good way to iterate with different processes and different people. If any of you listening has one of those cool projects for the good of humanity, just reach out. I'm always up to something new.
I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you're interested in any of the resources we mentioned, all the links are on the episode page of our website, theindustryofux.com. Thanks to Lucas for coming on the show. Thanks to Youssef Hemimi for the audio engineering work. And a big thank you to Demi He for the post-production work. If you have any feedback about the episode or the show, you can tweet @IndustryUX or leave a comment on our subreddit, The Industry of UX. If you really want to help or say thank you from the bottom of your heart, please leave a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. It helps us climb the charts and bring our show to a bigger audience. Last but not least, thank you for listening, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you next week.